Okay, our next interview here at the 2012 New York Antiquarian Book Fair is Brian Cassidy, who is, quote unquote, one of the younger dealers in our association. And I thought that from time to time we should have younger dealers interspersed with the old timers because it's interesting to get their point of view on the same kinds of questions. So let's start real easy, Brian. Tell us a little bit about your parents, siblings, where you grew up, where you went to school. Give us a little biopic through college if you went.
Okay. I was born and raised in New Jersey, Monmouth County. My father was a electrical engineer who worked for the same company his entire life. He started as a summer job, and then eventually he retired a few years ago as an executive at a public utility. My mother was a school teacher and a homemaker. She stayed home with I have one sister. She stayed home with my sister and I till we were probably, 10 or 12. And then she went back to work as a school teacher. Both of them are retired. I went to public school through 8th grade in a town called Ocean Township, which is obviously by the ocean. And then went to school, to private school for high school, to a Catholic all-boys school called Christian Brothers Academy in Lincroft. And then from there went to Loyola University in Baltimore and studied writing and English. And that was probably the beginning of a really strong interest in books. And graduated there in 1990. No, wait, I graduated from high school in 1990. I graduated from Loyola in 1994, and then went on for a master's degree in poetry. I got an MFA from the University of Iowa. So that would have been 1996.
1996. Are you married?
I'm married.
Children?
I have a daughter. She's 10. My wife is a naval officer. She works in the Pentagon. She works for the Secretary of the Navy right now. So we've moved around quite a bit in my book-selling career. As a bookseller, we've lived everywhere from New Jersey to Norfolk, Virginia to California, and now we're in D.C.
Okay, is this going to be more or less of a permanent thing, do you think, or you think
the book selling, or where we are?
Where you are.
We should be in D.C., but for the next few years and possibly even beyond that. We would like to stay if we could, and the odds are pretty good that we will be able to if we want to.
Do you have an open shop?
I had an open shop for almost 3 years in California. I bought an existing store when we moved there, and that was in Monterey. The shop was right off of Cannery Row, and really enjoyed that experience and would have happily continued it, but for my wife's career and her transfer. And then I had been working out of my house in DC for a couple of years, but just this past year took office space near downtown Silver Spring where I live, where I'm open by appointment and have a showroom. So I don't really consider it a shop in that I'm not making any effort to have sort of street traffic, but I'm happy to have people by appointment.
Approximately when did you first open your first business shop?
I started the business name is Brian Cassidy Bookseller, which I chose pretty much just for simplicity's sake, knowing that I was going to be moving around frequently. I didn't want to have to take doing business as ads every time we moved, so that made it very simple. I started that in May of 2004, and that had grown sort of organically and unconsciously from after I graduated college, after I graduated from graduate school. I taught for a while. I taught high school, I taught some college, but most of that was part-time, and most of it was sort of on an adjunct basis. Didn't pay very well, and so I supplemented that by working in bookstores, which was something that I had done in Iowa when I was there, and eventually stopped teaching altogether when I started working at the Tattered Cover in Denver, which is one of the largest independent new bookstores in the country.
Right around the corner from Hermitage.
Correct. And I worked there for almost 5 years, I think, and eventually was one of their buyers. I bought for their newsstand, and I ran some of their poetry events there. And while I was doing that, I started some sort of amateur book scouting. There were a lot of bookstores in Boulder,
Oh yeah.
and I discovered that if I started at the library and went into their little, where they had books for sale and bought 10 or 20 decent trade paperbacks for 50 cents each, that I could walk to the Boulder bookstore and get $30 of credit for it. And I could buy a couple nice books and maybe walk them up to another bookshop that would, but most of that was really just done to support my own book buying habit. I really didn't think of it as a business.
You were actually a runner.
I was a runner, yeah.
In a sense.
Yeah, but again, it was really for my own. I always had an end goal in mind, and I knew the book that I wanted to end up with, so I would work backwards from there. But when my daughter was born and my wife was assigned to her first ship, and was gone a lot, and I was trying to think about what I might want to do, I had all of these books that I had gathered both from scouting and also from working in bookstores for so many years. I had signed books and advanced readers' copies and proofs and things like that. And the idea of starting to sell them kind of started to percolate, and it really just developed from there.
Tell our viewers a little bit about the kind of inventory that you have and the kinds of books, pamphlets, etc., that you like to handle.
I like to say that I broadly specialize in the 20th century avant-garde, with particular emphasis on the beat poets and the beat writers, the New York School poets, and I have a kind of special affinity for the magazines and publications from the Mimeo Revolution, which would be the small magazines from about the mid to late 50s through the late 70s or so, when two things happened. One was the mimeograph machine became affordable, and so a lot of artists and poets were buying those to run off their own magazines and distribute them themselves for very little money. And then the other thing that happened was a lot of letterpress, as offset became cheaper, a lot of letterpress printing presses were sold very cheaply that then artists picked up on and produced their own magazines and books that way. And that period in there is one that I like a lot.
The California publishers, Oyez, Black Sparrow,
Exactly.
Incredible poetry.
I like the vitality of it.
Yeah.
I like the immediacy of it. I like that for them there was no asking for permission or looking for a sort of higher authority to do what they were doing. They wrote it, they published it themselves, they sold it themselves, and that gives it a kind of energy that I'm very interested in.
I'm going to ask you a little bit about the kind of world that we live in, book-wise. What percentage of your business comes from the internet? What percentage from catalogs? What percentage from fairs? Can you compartmentalize that for us?
Very little. I'll start with the internet. And when I say internet, what I'm talking about are what I would think of as passive sales. Sales to someone who I don't know, who I haven't dealt with previously, for books that I have cataloged and put up online on Abe or Amazon or Libris or something like that. That constitutes perhaps 10 or 15% of my business. It's very small. Fairs are probably 40%. Catalogs are probably catalogs and quotes. Let's keep those together. Quoting and catalogs, which I think of as kind of direct sales, are the remainder, which is probably another 40 or 45%.
How many catalogs a year printed that you distribute? How many catalogs a year do you think you do?
I've done 6 so far, and it was about once a year, and now it's about twice a year.
Okay. And how many book fairs have you participated in on an annual basis?
I do at least 4 or 5 a year, and have for the last 4 or 5 years.
Are they all ABAA fairs, or are they regionals? Or?
No, I do. When I was on the West Coast, I always did the San Francisco Fair and then the ABAA Fair. If it was in California. Now that I'm on the East Coast, I do this fair, the New York Fair, Boston, the ABA Boston. Because I'm in DC, I do there's the Roslyn Fair in DC.
Oh yeah.
And then I always do the Baltimore Summer Antique Show. And then I usually pick up 1 or 2 or 3 small fairs. This year I did the New Jersey Book Fair. I'll do a small fair in Richmond, Virginia later this month.
John Curtis was talking about that. when I interviewed him.
Mm-hmm.
He said a bunch of booksellers have gotten together and they're going to put on a book fair.
Yeah, and I think the model that they're using, which is one that is slightly modeled on RBMS, where you have a couple of tables and some shelves on it, and you keep your costs low, and you bring just a selection. I think that's a really viable and interesting model. You don't need a lot of effort to put it on. You don't need a lot of overhead. It doesn't have to cost a lot. And you can afford to do a very short fair. And if you can target, if there's a market that you can tap into to kind of come, whether that be in a university town where you can be inviting professors and students and the local librarians, or someplace where there's a decent concentration like Boston or New York of special collections librarians. I think those are the kind of events that could be very successful with as I say, much less overhead and labor than, say, this fair requires.
As a younger bookseller, one who has not been in the trade for a long, long time, what do you think about these trends that are coming, where it used to be most of the books and stuff that you would see exhibited were hardbound or pamphlets, and now there seems to be an awful lot more visual things being shown, posters,
Stuff on paper.
albums, ephemera. Of course, this is the kind of stuff that was perishable, and perhaps it deserves to be preserved like it is. But do you handle much of that?
I do a lot of that.
Broadside poetry?
Broadsides, but also flyers for punk rock shows, posters for poetry readings, any kind of ephemera like that. I think that's a smart direction to move. For one thing, like you say, a lot of that isn't preserved and should be and needs to be, and gives a picture of the scenes from which it originated that you can't otherwise get. But also, and I've said this before to some colleagues, that really what book dealers have always been are purveyors of culture. That's really what we sell. And that means that I don't think it's outside of scope for a book dealer to handle an album or to handle a poster or even a video game, or that's all stuff that culturally important artifacts, I think, are things that we shouldn't shy away from, even if they're not book related.
How do you feel about the social media that has sprung up over the last several years? Are you involved in any of that?
I do. I wouldn't say it's not something that I consciously cultivate. It's more of sort of a habit. I think of the social media that I partake in as kind of my online personality. When all business was more or less transacted either face-to-face in a storefront or over the phone or at a fair like this, people got your personality by meeting you and getting to know you. When you're talking about the internet and email and all of that, I think that there's still that desire to know who you're dealing with.
I think so.
And so that what social media becomes is not so much promotion or marketing, which I think is how a lot of people approach it. And I think it's much more a matter of familiarity breeding comfort, of being out there as a personality of some shape or form that people can see, read, and get to know to some extent, and that helps foster business relationships.
Do you have a Facebook? Are you on Facebook?
I am, yeah. And I have a Twitter, and I have a blog.
No,
all of them are often neglected, but I do have all of those things.
Yeah. I'm always getting a little email that says you have notifications on your Facebook page.
Exactly, but I've sold material on Facebook.
Yeah, as I have,
Yeah.
and I'm an old timer, so I figure if I can do it, the young people must be doing it too.
Yeah, no, I've sold a number of things on Facebook. I have a colleague who acquired a major archive through Twitter. If he hadn't been on Twitter,
Really?
a six-figure archive that came to him because of a couple of things that he tweeted. So it's as I say, I don't like to think of it as marketing. I really just like to think of it as it's kind of hanging your sign out there.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Especially if you're not someone who participates in book fairs or issues catalogs, you need to have some sort of a presence. I think anyhow.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've asked some of the so-called older booksellers is what I'm going to ask you next. Where do you see this trade going? Do you think there's going to be viable trade 20, 25 years in the future? I mean, you're a young enough guy who's going to be around 25 years from now. I'm not. And maybe I feel like that's a good thing for me. But what do you see? Can you look into a crystal ball a little bit?
I'm very optimistic. I think that the book trade is unquestionably changing. And I think a few things. What makes me optimistic is that right now, more so than at any other point in history, people are interacting with text and the word. They are doing more reading and more writing than at any other point in human history. Now, that's different kinds of reading and writing than was happening before, but nonetheless, email, texts, blogs, Facebook, that's all verbal. That's all textually based. And to that extent, there are always going to be people who are interested in the printed word. Now, as books become more electronic, I think what we tended to think of as the used book market is going to be an increasingly difficult place to make a living.
Agreed.
But I think for what we do at a fair like this, where we're selling, I don't like to call them artifacts because that makes them, I don't know, seem somehow dead, but where we are selling more than simply the content of what is in the book. Where you're selling the object. I think there's always going to be people who are interested in those. What they're interested in and the kinds of objects that they're interested in may be different. But there will always be people who are interested in those sorts of items, whether it be for their visual quality, whether it be for the craftsmanship that went into it, whether it is as a pure piece of nostalgia from one's childhood. There's always going to be people who will seek those things out. The other thing that I comfort myself with is the rare book world has always been, at least to my eye, a niche of a niche of a niche. It's never been reading has never been wildly popular.
No.
Books have never been wildly popular. They've waxed and waned for sure, but readers tend to be, and people who are interested in books tend to be very passionate. And I don't see that passion going anywhere.
I mean, my wife has a Kindle. Mm-hmm. And she said, why are you spending money buying these books when you can get them for nothing on the Kindle? Mm-hmm. I wanted to read the James Joyce, I wanted the poems penny each, stuff like that. She said, it's free on Kindle.
Yeah.
So I tried.
Yeah.
I just can't get comfortable.
I had a Kindle, I have a Kindle, and I bought it when it first came out in no small part because I sort of wanted to see what we were up against. Yeah. I do use it, but I am finding that I read actual books on it less and less. I tend to read stuff that I clip off the internet and send to the Kindle because I prefer it to reading on a screen.
Really?
But that more and more I'm preferring the book. Now I think that has much more to do with my own preferences than any sort of intrinsic value in the printed book. I suspect that preference is going to diminish more and more as we go along, which is why I say, the used book market and even the new book market is going to be increasingly difficult, and it's never been easy in the first place. But there will still be people who are reading all of those things, and someone may read Alice in Wonderland on the Kindle, but what we as book dealers are aiming at are the 0.001% of people who then become interested in the publication history of the book and want different editions and want to figure out what those different editions say about the reception of Alice in Wonderland. And that's people who do that. They're always going to be around, but they're a very small minority and always have been.
As you were coming into the trade and maturing yourself in it, were there any booksellers who were like mentors to you?
I don't think I had a mentor per se, but I had a lot of dealers who were very kind to me and very patient and very encouraging. When I put my first catalog out, Kevin Johnson at Royal Books called me and had nice things to say about it and encouraged me to join the ABAA and offered to sponsor me. So that was very encouraging, and he's always been very supportive of my career. I didn't know Peter Howard well, but he was always, again, very encouraging and very kind.
That was always a great place to buy the kind of thing that you are interested in.
Yeah, and Peter was really interesting because he was more curious about you than he was about what he could sell you, almost.
Yeah.
I mean, the first time that I met him, he spent a good 20 minutes or half an hour really grilling me. It felt very much like an interrogation about what did I sell and even more, who do I sell it to? He said something to me in that first meeting, something along the lines of, anyone can get books. Do you have customers? Who are you selling these books to? And that was a really influential idea for me. If you have enough money, anybody can acquire stock.
Right.
It's knowing what to do with it and who to sell it to that's really the key.
That's the trick.
Yeah. I've always thought very fondly of Peter, and also of dealers who I've made mistakes with, who have not held it against me.
For example,
John Crichton. I had asked John for some help with an unusual item that I had, and this was at the Colorado Seminar, actually, when I attended. And he pointed me in a couple of directions, and he said, I might have a customer for it. When you have it cataloged, quote it to me. And I said, okay. And then I think 3 or 4 years went by. It was something that I was holding back for a catalog. And had it out for about 5 minutes at a book fair when it was bought. And then the catalog went out, and John called me and said, do you still have it? And then he said, I thought you said you were going to quote that to me. And I thought, I did say that, didn't I? And was,
all you can do is apologize.
I was deeply embarrassed and just felt terrible about it, and thought to myself, there goes. And this was before I was in the ABAA, and had very much and was very much thinking and wanting to apply, and on the path to applying, and thought to myself, I just shot myself in the foot there. But again, he was very decent about the whole thing, and I don't think has held it against me.
John's a very nice person.
Yeah.
Very nice person. One of the things that I always get a kick out of is the eras in which younger booksellers are dealing in. It seems to me that people of your age and your experience are dealing more in the middle to later 20th century, as opposed to guys like myself who are dealing in the 18th and 19th century.
I think there's some truth to that. A lot of it is you're drawn to the sorts of artists and writers and figures who were influential for you in your youth. So I listen to a lot of punk rock. I have a lot of punk rock in my booth right now. I read a lot of Allen Ginsberg when I was, writing poetry. I have a lot of beat stuff in my booth right now. There is a kind of direct correlation there. That said, one of the things that I try to do as a dealer is, for things that aren't directly in that genre or in that wheelhouse, is to try and connect them in ways that they wouldn't otherwise be connected. So one of the other things that I like to specialize in are handmade and unique books, things like scrapbooks, photo albums, diaries, handmade gift books, any kind of unique book that was done by hand, preferably for a kind of private audience, something that someone made for themselves, or made for a loved one, or made for a very small audience. For me, those are very much the kind of book equivalent for vernacular photography or of outsider art. And to make that kind of parallel, for me, is what I think part of the bookseller's job is to look at things that have come before and to put them in a context, so that the object itself doesn't change, but the context you're putting it in does, so that it appeals to or is understandable to younger buyers, or other buyers who wouldn't think of looking at it otherwise.
The organization, as an organization, is an aging organization, as you are well aware of. It seems to me that most of the booksellers are like over 60 or under 40. And there doesn't seem to be very many in the middle ground. And another thing that I would like to see personally is more women getting involved in book selling.
It's a tough business to get into because the door into it, there's kind of a narrow door into
Yeah.
it. You can apprentice with someone,
Right.
which is a great way, but that's happening less and less, and the opportunities for that to happen are less and less. You can do what I did, which is essentially I bootstrapped it for 3 years, and my wife was kind enough to allow me to indulge in this with some hope that it would eventually pay off.
Right.
Not everybody is in that situation, or you have to have a lot of money, because it's a very capital-intensive business, and again, not a lot of people are in that position. And I think there's this narrow window and very small doorways where you can sort of sneak into the business. I was able to do it because I was young enough that I didn't feel like I was really losing anything career-wise by sort of taking this kind of gamble. And I had someone to support me while I did it. I think I think part of the reason that you're seeing that kind of separation between the sort of over 60 and under 40 is under 40 you have a bit more freedom, fewer or no kids, fewer obligations. Right. You're feeling more adventurous. You're not as tied down. But once you start getting 40 and 45, you start having many more obligations. You're much more established in whatever career you're in, and so the risks of stepping away from that are much greater. And so I think when you start seeing some other dealers come in is when they are a little bit older and maybe are retiring early. Maybe do have some capital, or maybe have a collection of their own that they're dispensing of that has taken them some time to acquire. So I think right now that demographic where it's a little thin in the sort of 40 to 60 range, and I think I agree with that. I think that has something to do with just the logistics of getting into the business in the first place. It was probably a little bit more spread out in the past because there was much more opportunity to apprentice. So you could come up in the business. And now it's much harder to do that.
Last question.
Yeah.
How old are you?
I'm 39.
Okay. So you're just at the cusp.
I'm just at the cusp.
And
yeah.
you're getting into that no man's land pretty soon.
I'm really I'm excited about my 40s in this business. I think it's exciting. There's fun material out there. I'm seeing a lot of young people on the floor today.
Yeah.
I'm selling to a lot of young people, and also very encouraging. Most of the curators that I deal with are my age.
Well, that you've got going for you.
There's a really, really good crop of special collections librarians and curators who are 40, 45 and under, who are really, I think, tuned in to what a lot of us younger dealers are doing. So, like I say, I'm hopeful.
Well, you articulate yourself very well. I enjoyed this interview. We've come to a close on our time, and I thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.